So we can hear you.
Yeah, yellow, huh? I'm hearing you.
Okay, you're online. Please go ahead.
Okay, so good afternoon. I'm trying to be concise and I think that this presentation can be very short. So next slide. Next slide. So as we are talking in NMRG and the ANIMA working group, there is a minimum set of properties that we conceive as necessary for an autonomic system. And these properties, there are different kinds of definitions for these properties, but usually we can talk about that network must be automatic, adaptive, and aware. So this is translated into different definitions such as self-chop, MapK, and others. And we use this kind of research is usually addressed by the network management area. So for example, in the conference such as IEM, NOMS, and CNSM. And in IETF, and I'm going to talk about this, maybe the correct form for that is the NMRG. So next slide. So, as a perspective, this the first mentions in autonomic networking, they occurred in 2005 and 2006. So there are several antecedents for that. For example, the artificial intelligence in network management, which there are several research activities in the 90s. Then self-organization networks and declarative policy and so forth. And there are also several papers, and some of these papers were written by contributors of NMRG, such as John and other people. Next slide. So there is this, we can talk about the research scope for the autonomic networking, considering different kinds of technologies and perspectives and approaches for that. So for example, artificial intelligence, policies, machine learning, and some of these topics were addressed by the previous presenters in this meeting. So I believe this is kind of something that we can agree on that. And this the research spans in the whole ICT spectrum. So this can be applied for wired and wireless network and fixed and mobile and so forth. Next slide. So the autonomic networking movement, it got a lot of momentum around 2007 and 2009. So there are lots of papers on that and an editorial in the Communications Magazine journal and other interesting and influent papers were published at that point. And also there are some projects that started to address this property known as the autonomic networking ones. Next slide. So just to mention, there are lots of projects, especially projects in the European Union, considering autonomic networking functions and properties. And some of these projects, they use the term autonomic networking, and others, they use some properties that are commonly associated to autonomic networking, but they didn't use the name autonomic networking. Next slide. So there is an decrease in interest in autonomic networking, considering academic research perspectives around 2011, 2013, and there are some reasons that we can cite for that. For example, there are at that point other technologies that were gaining momentum, such as SDN and NFV. The researchers started to use different terms for autonomic networking, such as cognitive networking, intelligence-driven network. So the terms, they changed a little at that point. And there's also something that I think that today is still a problem in that area, in this area, which is the lack of successful deployment case. So, for example, there are a lot of frameworks and tools and the research efforts on autonomic networking, but it's difficult to point out, especially in that point, successful deployment case. And at this point, I also started some work on standardization. For example, NTSI, and also in the IETF with the ANIMA working group. Next slide.
You have to come to the conclusion, Jefferson.
Okay, next slide. Maybe you can go to the next slide. Next slide. So at least at one point there is the ANIMA working group, and at the organization of the org group, when the chairs were organizing the charter for the org group, there is this definition that the points or the topics that are outside the charter can be encouraged as an individual submission, but more important as NMRG submissions. Next slide. So there are potential application areas for this, and considering the areas that are not addressed by the ANIMA working group. So for example, high virtualized and programmable infrastructures, and there is this NMRG internet draft on some of these kind of infrastructures. There is this application on 5G and IoT and smart X, smart something. Also, it's important to have a better link with real-world operations, for example, RIPE, NOG, and other stuff. And also, it's important to understand if there is some effective deployment and the reasons for the lack of wide-scale deployment on Autonomic networking. Next slide. And I'm trying to be very fast. Sorry about that. So the question is, there is a need, interest, or energy for Autonomics 3.0 in the NMRG? So if the answer is yes, and I believe it's yes, I propose 4 efforts on that, and the first one is to pursue the some work on intent-based networking, and I believe that the next presenter, I think it's Alex, and he will talk about that. And also, I think it's important to have some work on AI and ML for network management. That there were also a presentation on this topic. Also, it's important to have an integration with other network automation approaches, such as zero-touch network and service management. And also, I think maybe we are in a point that it may be interesting to revisit the 7575, 7576, which are the RFCs that bootstrap ANIMA working group. So maybe we can revisit these RFCs. For example, thinking what is out of ANIMA scope in a long term. There will be a recharter on ANIMA, I believe, in November. So maybe we can, you can look at these documents, and in the new ANIMA charter and CO, maybe there is some gap that we can address in NMRG. So I mean, I think that's it. Sorry about that.
I mean, Jefferson, also we are already over time, and you may risk to be cut. Dean has a comment, and I would also like to have a concluding comment.
I'm a big proponent of autonomic networking. I disagree that we have to go already to Autonomics 3.0. We have a lot of work to do in the current framework, and my main issue is these days we still have one problem. All the exception handling in networks is still done by the human operator. We have to figure out how to automate the exception handling from a service level perspective, from a network service level perspective, instead of just focusing on a device. And if we can lay some foundation on which we can build the next levels on top of that, that would be great. But we have too many holes in the lower layers to go to the to the next levels.
Thank you, John.
John Strassner. So I broadly agree with Dean. As you know, I'm a big fan of intent networking. I'm working on it actively. I think the biggest problem with going to Autonomics 3.0 or X.Y is that everyone forgets about knowledge representation. And this is a fundamental requirement for any serious AI practitioner or researcher. It's also called knowledge engineering. What Dean was just talking about has been called the qualification problem. So for any common sense rules that you want to encode, there's a huge number of exceptions, right? So how do I make a generic statement and then qualify it to be applicable, and that's certainly present in networking. So without better knowledge representation mechanisms, and not just ontologies, right? But I mean, ontologies, most IETFers don't even know how to spell the word, let alone what it means. So we need to make a focused effort in knowledge representation. And as a general thing, yes, deep learning's important and machine learning and blah, 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 but they're so generic that we're just going to spin our wheels and not do anything.
I think
End of rant.
I'm speaking more as a contributor also to this effort with Jefferson and Lisandro, is that the message you wanted to pass is we acknowledge all the body of work that have been done in autonomic networking, cognitive networking, whatever you call it. But there may be stuff that we still need to address. And I think collectively, as Dean mentioned, John, and maybe others with the previous presentation, we need to identify specific areas, specific domains where we want to concentrate activity of this research group to say, there are still things to do on that that could help the research and could help eventually also standardization. So it's just kind of a call for get together and identify those areas together. So, we are over time. We need to close because there will be another working group after that. I talked with Alex, so he's not. It's okay that we skip his presentation. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for staying with us, even with the power outage. Thank you for the remote presenters. It was not easy to understand what's happening. So we have still a session after this one, which will be a more general discussion about networks and AI. And we also have this dedicated meeting tomorrow on intent-based networking. Thank you very much. And don't forget the blue sheets. If you have not signed it, we can still have time to do that. Can I also, yes, see the lady for the minutes? Thank you.
I can see.